Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Decryption and I hope you are well. Factions in games are such a key concept that sometimes are not even made part of the main core game loop. They're just there to add atmosphere and extras to the game. Other games take full advantage of these. Think of a game like The Saboteur, a game where you play an Irishman in France fighting Nazis. It's a classic game. There are no needs for factions there, but there are actually factions there. There's three. You have the Nazis, you have the player and the people who fight against the Nazis, the revolutionists, and then you have the civilians. Three factions. Think of games like Cyberpunk. You have less use over them, but the factions are there. You have the Valentinos, you have Maelstrom, you have the Animals. They hate each other, but you can't influence it. Whereas other games, you have full influence over it, such as Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. You have the Ballers, you have Grove Street. The more you fight, the more ranking you get, the more the other one hates you. So in today's tutorial, we're going to look at making our own faction system, where you can either leave out all the updates if you don't want to run it that way, or you can add them in, and the more quests or damage you do, the more it increases the relationship between the factions. So let's get started. So to get started with our relationship, we're going to actually need to start creating faction data so we know which faction is which. We need a way to specify who they are. So if you've already got something where you group faction data, that's fine. You can just use that. However, if you don't, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and create a new folder in here called primary data assets. And inside here, I'm just going to go to my blueprint class and I'm going to create a new primary data asset. Now, if you've never used primary data assets before, they're super easy. So follow along and you'll understand what they are. So I'm going to call mine PDA faction and I'm going to open it up. So the primary data asset is a way we store variables. It's a template for what we're going to create later for each faction. You can't do specific faction extra variables. That's not the point of this. This is a generic faction data asset. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and add all the variables I want to store in my data asset about my factions. So I'm going to store their name, which I will set to a type of text so it's translatable. I'm going to make sure it's visible, and then I'm going to come down and also add icon, and I'm going to set it to a type of texture 2D, but I'm going to make sure it's a soft object reference. This means it's not going to load the icon in memory until we actually need it. Next, I'm going to add a description, so I'll set this to a text again. You can add whatever you want here. The name is probably the only mandatory one you need. The rest is if you just want it. And then you can add anything else here you want. If you want to add some specific gang weapons, colours, if you want to do icons and stuff, vehicles, anything you want. If it belongs to that faction and it's not going to change, is the key aspect, add it in here. So for the name, icon and description for the faction, it's not going to change. I'm going to keep it like that. So I'm going to compile and I'll just Control-Shift-S to save. So now that we have our new primary data asset, I'm going to come back to my blueprints and I'm going to create a new folder called data asset. And inside here, I'm going to create another folder called factions to store them all. And now we're going to create our actual data assets from our primary data asset. I'm going to right click miscellaneous and I'm going to choose data asset. In here, I'll be able to search for my PDA faction and I'm going to click select. And I will call this one faction underscore. And then this is where you can start naming your factions. So my game is primarily focused to like elves, humans, fantasy setting kind of thing. So I've come and found a fantasy elf army name generator because that works. And then we've got a few here, so I'll just do a couple of English names. The Paladins, that sounds like a good faction, so we'll drop that in. So I'll call mine faction underscore Paladins. And I'm going to open this up. So in here, we can just now set its details. I don't have an icon yet, so for now I'm just going to use the little demon character. And the description, you can populate this later on. This will be more for lore if you have a description. Eventually, I plan to have my description so you can unlock the gangs and then you won't know who they are. You interact with them, you get some basic details, you find out more, it'll unlock in the journal kind of thing. And that's all I'm going to do for that one. Another one I'm going to create, which is actually quicker just to duplicate it sometimes, is I'm just going to create a faction but unaffiliated, and all this is going to be is the civilians. Sometimes you might not want it. If you've got civilians that always belong to a faction, then you don't need this. For me, I don't, so I'm just going to use this civilian faction. So basically all of my NPCs, like fishermen for example, in this game, they won't belong to a faction. They'll just, they'll live in a kingdom, but that's it. So yeah, so I'll set them to unaffiliated. And then lastly, depending on how your game works, you may or may not want to create a faction specifically for your player. If you think of games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, you don't really have a player faction. You belong to Grove Street full stop. The ballers will attack you no matter how rich you are in the game or anything like that. It just depends on how friendly they are with Grove Street. But then some games, like for example, Skyrim, you can go the entire game factionless, but yet people will learn to dislike you. So it's entirely up to you. For my game, I am going to create a faction for the player. So I'm just going to call it faction player. And there's my faction for my player. Then I can come and cross these off because we don't need them anymore. Next, we're going to need a struct, which is going to store the actual relationships in the game. So it's going to say this faction and this faction have this relationship. Now, the key difference to the way we're going to do it is that we're going to have a faction 1 and a faction 2, but we need to make sure we're not going to cross them over. So if we have faction 1 as paladins, faction 2 as the player, we don't want another faction of the player and then paladins but reverse, because then they can become out of sync. So the way we're going to do it is whenever we're doing a check against faction 1 and faction 2, we're also going to check faction 2 and faction 1, just to make sure we cover all bases, and it means we only ever have one data between these two factions. So we're saying these two factions are this relationship, no matter what order we check it. So to start with doing this, I'm going to come to my blueprints and I'm going to create a new structs folder, and this is going to be for my structures. So I'm going to right click blueprint structure and I'm going to call it s_faction relationship, and I'm going to open it up. The first one I'm going to add is faction 1, and I'm literally going to call it faction 1, and I'm going to search for my PDA faction here. I'm going to add another variable and I'll call this faction 2, and then finally I'm going to add a relationship variable which is going to be an integer, and this will be the value of these. I'm going to make sure I come and tick save game for all of these, so if you ever want to save it later, because you probably will, it's already pre-done for you. There we go. So now we can start using this. So now you need to think where you want to store it. If you've got multiple levels where you want different factions, maybe you've got a weird mini game or something, then you may want to look somewhere else for it. However, in most games, the faction you start the game with will proceed throughout the game. It will be adapted, changed, stuff like that. So I'm actually going to come and store mine on my game instance. So I don't currently have a game instance, so I'm going to come into my MISC folder and I'm going to right click blueprint class and I'm going to search for game instance. The reason we're using the game instance is as soon as your game starts to as soon as your game is closed, the game instance is loaded and you can use it to transport data across levels and such. It's perfect for something like the faction system, which you're going to want throughout the entire game no matter what level you go into. Whether you enter a cave or a dungeon or a castle, the faction's going to remain. Then I'm going to come in and select that and I'll call it GI main, so game instance main. Now that we've selected it, I'm just going to go to edit, project settings. We just need to tell the game this is our game instance, and I'm going to go to maps and modes, game instance, I'll search for GI main, which is mine, and I can double click and open this up. So in here I'm going to create a new variable called faction relationships, and I'm going to search for our s_faction relationship. I'm going to make sure I come up and set it as an array because we want more than one, and I'm going to make sure it's public just so we can access it from outside, and I'm also going to add it to a category of relationship. So if we compile, you can now come in and you can add in all the different factions you want. So by default, if you want the paladins to hate the player, you can come in and select it in any way and set it to whatever stats you want. We're going to make the stats actually mean something later, so for now I'm just going to keep it as empty, but that's where you'll default it if you want to. It's also where you'll load it into. So if you're loading your save game, you will populate this faction relationships. If you're saving, you will drag it from there. So one other nicety I'm going to do for later is I'm going to add an event dispatcher here. If you don't know what an event dispatcher is, see my latest video, and I'm going to call it on faction relationship updated, and then for the input I'm going to set it to faction update, and it will be a type of our faction relationship. This just means whenever we update the relationships, we can automatically call this event dispatcher, which will tell anything we need, such as new quests to spawn or a notification system, anything you want. We can call this event dispatcher. It'll tell us which faction's been updated to what, and then we can deal with it. So as I said earlier, with the faction numbers to figure out what they mean, we need to start putting them into states. So these numbers represent a certain state. So in order to list these states, I'm going to come to my blueprints and I'm going to create a new folder called enums, and inside here I'm going to go right click blueprint enumeration and I'm going to call it e faction states, and inside here this is where you add all the different rankings you want. So I don't know how other games do this. I know games like San Andreas just makes them hate you more the more you attack them, kind of thing, but there are some games where the more damage you do, the more quests you do, the more they'll hate you. A prime example is actually GTA 1 or 2, where the more missions you do, you'll see the faction rankings go down. The more you help them, the more it goes up, and then the more aggressive they'll become, the more ranked it is, kind of thing. So I'm going to go for something like that in mind. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm just going to add one called member. This is, you are a part of this gang. You have done enough missions for them. They've brought you in. Think of terms like the Godfather. You're a member of the gang. They're going to protect you. They're going to help you. You can't really do much wrong. The next one I'm going to add is going to be friendly. This is, they're not going to attack you. If you steal from them, they're going to get a bit annoyed. They may or may not protect you on the streets, kind of thing. Next I'm going to add is my unaffiliated, and this is not the same as the faction unaffiliated. This is, they don't know who you are. They haven't a clue. They're not going to attack you. They're not going to steal from you. You're just a pure civilian at this point. And then this is where we get into the hateful territory for mine. I'm going to add a dislike and then an enemy. So a dislike is they'll see you on the streets, they may mug you, they may attack you, they may just let you get on with it. If you're provoking them, they're going to attack you full stop. An enemy is shoot on sight. You're a bad guy, we're going to take you out. Think Ballers and San Andreas, they're going to shoot you if they see you. And I'm going to save that. So that's my states that I'm going with in this game. And then now we're going to jump back to the structs folder, and we're actually going to rank these states how we want them. So we're going to say, in that integer value, you are a member if you are this integer between this integer. You are an unaffiliated if you're this integer to this integer, if that makes sense. So I'm going to come in and create a new struct. So blueprint structure, and I'm going to call it s underscore faction relationship ranks. So it's different to the relationship one. And in this ranks one, we're simply going to add two values, the state, which is the current state of the relationship. So I'll do e faction states, and then I'm going to add the range, which is going to be an int 32 range, and I'm going to save like so. So now that we have our enum to say what states we have with our relationship with this faction, and we have our struct where we can actually start storing it, we need somewhere to store it where it's not going to be loaded in memory unless we absolutely need it, but it's accessible when we need it. So I'm going to create mine as a data table. I'm going to come back to blueprints, and I'm going to right click folder data table, and inside here I'm going to right click miscellaneous data table, and we should be able to now select our s underscore faction relationship ranks, and I'm going to click OK. Now I'll call this dt underscore faction ranks. I'm going to open it up. So in here, if you've never used a data table before, it's pretty much just a bunch of cells and a bunch of rows, but we've predefined the structure of it. I'm going to come and click add at the top, and then straight down the bottom you can see the state. So I will say member, and then we can put the minimum and maximum integer range that they belong to. So for mine that I've already got noted down, yeah, I'm going to say you're a member if your maximum is 100 and your minimum is 51. So if that integer is between 51 and 100, you are classed as a member of that faction. I'm going to click add again, and I'm going to set it to the next one, which is friendly, and you have to do the ranges backwards. You have to set the max first, then move to the minimum. Just, it's a bit weird. So I'm going to say if it's between 50 and 11, and the reason I'm using 50 is the previous one is 51. You don't want them overlapping because you'll get some logic errors. So we've got friendly and member. After that, I'm going to set my unaffiliated, and I'm going to set that between -10 and 10, like so. And this is, so you're a civilian, you don't want to do one job, get 5 relationship rank points or whatever, and then instantly be friendly with them. Then it's not going to work like that. They're going to be like, oh, okay, he's not a bad guy, but we still don't know who he is, kind of thing. So there's a little bit of room for it until they become friendly. After this, I'm going to add another one for my dislike, which is going to be -50 and -10. And we're doing these backwards because you've got to think of the number timeline. -100 is lower than 100, so minimum goes down that way. And then finally, for my enemy, I'm going to set it to -100 and -51. So if you were to think immediately of a number, say 62, what ranking is that? We can look down all of these and go, okay, 62 is not between 11 and 50, 62 is between 51 and 100, so they are classed as a member. So it's super easy to justify what somebody belongs to without actually having to store it every single time. And then if we were to just store the enum on the faction, then you couldn't have an in-between value. You'd literally be unfriendly, then a member, and then that's it. Whereas with the number approach, you've got the flexibility to do 5 or 6 quests for somebody, then you get promoted. So now that we have our data table, we can now move on to actually creating our function library, which is going to help control all of the functions. So I'm going to come back to my blueprints, and I'm going to create a new folder called libraries. And inside here, I'm going to right click blueprint function library, and I'm going to call it BPFL factions. And I'm going to open this up. The first function it wants me to create, I'm going to call find faction relationship. I'm going to make sure it's ticked as a pure function. So if you remember on our game instance, where we have our faction relationships here, as I said to you before, we don't want the system to be able to go paladins and player, and we'll set them to -20, but then we don't want them to be able to come in and go player and paladins, which is just the reverse of it, and then 50, because then which faction are we looking at, which relationship? It doesn't make much sense to have them like that. It can get messy. So what this find function is going to do is search both values and return us the correct row, so we know what we're looking at. So the first thing I'm going to do is come and add 2 inputs. The first one will be the current faction. This will be the faction that is initiated the find, so the current faction, and it'll be a PDA faction. The second one will be another PDA faction, but this will be the check faction. So if your AI walks up to another AI, that first AI who walked up will be the current faction, and they're checking against the faction they've walked up to. It very well might be the exact same faction they've just walked up to a friend, in which case that's where you'd return member to say, you know, you're friendly kind of thing. And then while we're here, I'm going to add an output, and I'm going to return our faction relationship row, which will be our s_faction relationship. And then I'm also going to return an index, which we're going to use later when we update them. This will tell us in the list of faction ranks which one we need to update when we need to update it. And then I'm going to compile and save. So I'm going to drag this over here for now. So the first thing we need to do is we need to loop over all of the faction relationships from the game instance. So we need to actually get our factions now. So back on our game instance here, we could cast to it, but I'm going to instead write an interface so we don't have to cast to it. It's going to be a lot easier, and it just means every time we run this find, it's less likely to take more time casting. So I'm going to come back to my blueprints folder, and I'm going to go into my interfaces. I'm going to right click blueprint interface, and I'm going to call it BPI game instance. I'm going to open this up. I'm going to create a function called get faction relationships, and it's simply just going to output faction relationships, which is going to be s_faction relationship, and it's going to be an array. So it'll just return everything. And I'll compile and save. And then back on our game instance, we can come and go to the class settings, add our implemented interfaces, which means now we can double click this faction relationships and simply just return it like that, making it super lightweight, meaning we don't have to cast to it now. So back in our function library, I can simply do get game instance. From the world context object, I'll just do get world context. And then from the value, I can literally just call get faction relationships, just like that. I don't need to cast or do anything to it, which is perfect. So I'm going to come off of this faction relationships, and I'm going to loop over them all like so. And then this is where our complicated logic starts. So I'm going to break on here, and we need to check if this faction 1 equals current faction and faction 2 equals check faction. So we're checking if both our factions match up, or we need to flip it over and say faction 1 equals check faction and faction 2 equals current faction. It can get a little bit confusing, but it's super easy once we've done it once. But it's one of them things that once you've done it, you'll never have to touch it again. So I'm going to come in and drag off faction 1 here, and I'm going to go equals, and then I'm going to drag off from here and do get current faction, which is just a shortcut to this, so you're not dragging lines over. So that's our first one here. Then I'm going to drag off a faction 2, and I'm also going to do equals, and then from here I'm going to drag off and do get check faction, and then from here I'm going to do and. So if both of them equal that, then we can come up to the branch, and then we can successfully say yes, this is the right one. However, as I said, we need to reverse this. So from faction 1 I'm going to drag down and just do another equals, and then from here I'm going to drag off and do get check faction this time, so it's backwards. And then I'm going to do the same for faction 2. I'll do equals, just make sure your lines stay intact, and then I'm going to take the current faction and plug that in as well. And then finally I'm going to plug these two into an and again, and then now that we've got this, instead of this and plugging into here, I'm just going to drag off and say or like so. If you know a better way to do this, ladies and gentlemen, please let me know in the description. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it does. So what we've now created here is it will come in and it will check faction 1 against current faction and faction 2 against check faction. If both of them are true, then it will go up to the branch. If it's not true, then it'll trigger the or to come down here, check faction against faction 1, and then current faction against faction 2. So we're just testing 1 and 2, and then flipping it over 2 and 1. And then if both are true, then we come up to here like so. So if it's false, it means it's not found it currently, so then the loop will go to the next iteration, the next faction rank, which the next faction relationship, which we're okay with, so we're going to leave false alone. We're not going to do anything. However, if it's true, then we need to return the current faction rank because we know it's correct. So I'm just going to drag off of here and type return, and then we need to drag both of these and put them over here. So I'm just going to drag all of this across a little bit, and I'm going to set the array element to a variable current faction relationship so we can access it later without having to drag loads of lines. And I'm also going to set the index to a variable so we know later how to update it. And then we can just drag this down here to carry on with the branch. And then once we're down here, we can just simply come in, drag our two variables in like so. Now you might be thinking, what if the for loop goes over it and it doesn't find the faction? Now that is a good point. So what we're going to do is drag this returner down here to completed. So if the faction doesn't exist, then we're going to keep it as nothing, but I'm going to set the index to -1. So later on, we'll check if it equals -1, we know it doesn't exist. And I'm going to click complete. I'm going to click compile and save. So that's our find faction relationship. So this will run off and check, does this faction currently have a relationship with this other faction? Yes or no. So this brings us on to our next function. I'm going to add a new function called get faction relationship rank. So this one is actually going to get the rank between the two relationships. This first one is just simply going to tell you if they've got one or not, which is useful for both updating and getting it, whereas the get one will simply get us the rank. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to drag in my find faction relationship, and because we've marked it as pure, you can see we don't really need to connect it up, which is perfect. I'm going to drag these two variables up here, so we've got them them passed in. So when we say get the relationship between these two, it will be able to. And then the world context, I will just drag off and do get world context. After this, we need to get our new relationship ranks. So I'm going to drag up from this X pin and do get data table row names. And then this is where we're going to get our new faction ranks. There we go. And then I'm going to loop over all of these. And then I'm going to do one more of get data table row. And this will get our actual row from the faction. So this is now going to get all of our faction ranks, which is perfect. So now that we have this, we're going to break on the out row so we can actually see it. And now we need to actually start checking if this faction here is currently within these states here. So I'm going to drag off this faction relationship and I'm actually just going to promote it to a variable so we don't have to drag lines from it later. And I'm going to connect it all up. And then from the range here, I'm going to drag off and do break. And then from the lower bound, I'm going to drag off and do break. And then I'm going to do it for the same for the upper bound as well. If you neatly organize it, it won't be like so. So now we have the upper range and the lower range, the min and the max one. And this is where we can start checking if the player's relationship is within the range of it. So I'm going to right click and do in range int. And you'll see we can add in everything we need. So the minimum is the value. The maximum is this value. I'm going to make sure inclusive min and max is turned on. This means if the minimum is 50 and your value is 50, it will include 50. It won't say 51 and above. It'll say 50 and above. So it'll be included. And then for the value, we're just going to drag in our current faction row. I'm going to drag off and do break. I'm going to drag the relationship into value. And then on here, I'm just going to click hide connected pin so it's all neatly organized. So if this returns true, it basically means it's found the correct relationship. So from row found, I'll connect the branch up. So if we return true, we can come off and simply return the rank. So on my output node, I'll add an output and it'll be the faction state and it'll be the faction state type like so. So the state right here, I'm going to promote to a variable again, current faction rank. I'll plug it in because it means we don't have to drag loads of lines everywhere. And I'm going to plug it in right here. If it's false, it means it's not found it. So we can ignore it because it'll come back around and search again. However, if it doesn't find the faction rank at all, then this is where the completed one will kick in. So down here, I'm just going to come and do a print statement and I'll just plug in the world context. For the string, I'm going to do an append because if you're searching for two factions to figure out their rank and they don't exist, we should probably add them. So I'm just going to come in on my append here and I will say print a string error faction 1 paladins and player are not ranked, just so we know in the game there's a problem. It might be that instead of doing this, you just automatically add the rank if you want it. In other terms, you might want to story drive it, so it's kind of up to you. But what I'm going to do down here is I'm just going to come in, add a return, and I'm going to make sure it's set to unaffiliated. So pure neutral. They don't know who they are. If two opposing factions meet each other and they're supposed to fight, then you need to just make sure they're defaulted to be able to fight. And I'm going to hit compile and save. So that's our second function done. So now we really have one more function to do, which is to actually update the rank. And the update is going to take care of adding new ones and updating existing ones. So I'm going to come down and add a new function called update faction relationship. And we're pretty much going to come and copy just this first bit here and the current faction row because we need those two. I'm going to paste it in and align it up. And then I'm going to make sure these are promoted to variables because we need the two factions. I'm going to get the world context and I'm going to make sure that the current row is promoted to a variable so we can at least use it. There we are. So the first thing we need to check is this index. So we want to say if it equals -1, then we automatically know that this faction doesn't exist. We've already searched for it. It doesn't exist. So we need to add it. So if we come off of true, that's when we look into adding it. So because we don't want to cast to the game instance, I'm actually going to come back to my interface and I'm just going to add a new one called add faction relationships. And then I'm going to simply pass in our faction relationship and it'll be a type of S faction, but it'll be a single one. And what I'm also going to do while we're here is add a update faction relationships. And this one will again pass in the S faction. It'll be a faction relationship. And then we're also going to pass in the index that we want to update. So I'm going to type index and set it to a type of integer. So that when the add function is called, it will straight add it to the array of relationships. When the update is called, it will find the current one and update it, which is perfect. So we can come over to our game instance and we can start implementing these. So add, I will literally just drag this out, type add, and I will plug it in like so. And that's all this one needs to do. And then the update faction here will be the same one, but what we're going to do is drag our faction relationships in. I'm going to drag off and do set array lm for array element. I'm going to set the index to the index and the item to the item. And I'm going to make sure to align this. So now we have our two functions created. I can compile and save and we can jump back to our function library. So if it's true, it means it's not found it, so we need to add it. So I'm going to right click get game instance. I'm going to add the world context. And then from here, I'm just going to do add faction relationship like so. Plug it into the true. And now we need to build up the faction relationship we want to add. I'm going to drag off and do main. And now we need to plug in everything we have. So we know the faction 1 is the current faction. So we'll drag in current faction. We know the faction 2 is our check faction. And then the relationship we actually need to promote to a variable. So I'm just going to drag this over here and connect it all. And now we've got a variable variable here, we can just drag off and do get relationship. So this means whenever we call update faction, we have to set what the relationship is. So I'm not going to do it as a you're setting what the new value is. I'm going to do it as in this is what you're increasing it or decreasing it by. So if we pass in -10, it'll decrease it by -10 when we add it to it. So that means when we first add it, the value we're passing into it is going to be the starting relationship. I'm going to drag this up here and I'll just do add faction. It doesn't add faction relationship. It doesn't exist. So from here, I'm just going to come and return. So one thing I have forgot is we've just added a faction relationship here. We've not told the event dispatcher on the game instance that we've updated it. So after we make changes here, I'm just simply going to come in and call it, adding it to the end of here, and I will add in the faction relationship like that. And I will do the same thing down here, adding in a new value like so. So this means every time we update it, add a new one, it will automatically call it, and then we'll be all good. One tidy thing I'm going to do here is just cut this, add it to a new event graph called factions, and add it here. So it just means if we have any other events here, it's all neatly tucked away where it needs to be. Now the next thing we need to look at is actually updating it if we do find it. So when we are updating it, we just need to change the current faction to what we need. I'm going to drag in the current faction row, and I'm going to drag off and do set members. And then the members we want to set in here is just the relationship. So I'm going to untick that one, and I'm going to plug this into the false. So I'm going to drag from here and do break, and I'm going to drag the relationship and do plus, and then finally we can add in our relationship here. If we pass in -10 and our relationship is currently 20, 20 plus -10 will be 10. So it'll add it and it'll do it perfectly for what we need. And then I can just click on the break and hide unconnect pins to make it neater. And now that we've set the members in here, we can again get the game instance and we can do update faction relationship where we plug it in, we plug the new struct into it, and then the index, thankfully, we stored it back here. So I'm also going to come and promote this to a variable, which I will call current faction index. I'll make sure it's all plugged in like so. And then over here, we can drag in the current faction index and plug it in. And finally, with a return, everything is updated. I will add in one final comment of update faction. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That is officially the faction system done. Now, at the moment, it's a bit useless because we haven't got much of functionality for it, but you can use it for anything you want. For example, say if you have AI roaming around and he walks over to this guy might have a faction of paladins and this other faction is an enemy faction. We will call get faction relationship rank on the behavior tree, and then if the faction is negative, then we would make them start attacking each other, for example, or if it's positive, make them say hello or something. So let's update our NPCs to actually store factions on them. I'm going to come on and open up my NPC here, and I'm going to open it up and see if there's a base class. So I have a C++ class of ALS character, which is okay, but I'm not going to go and edit the C++ for this one. So depending on how you've got your setup, I've got my name in dialog here, and then I'm also going to check my player just to see how they're set up. So on here, let's have a look at them. They also have ALS character. So I've basically got two classes, both belonging to ALS character, but both of them are not the same one, which means in future, if we wanted to get the relationship from these, we'd have to cast them, which is not something we want to do. So let's add an interface. So I'm going to go to my interfaces here, and I've already got BPI character. So I can see on my here, I have BPI character, and on my NPC, I also have BPI character. So I already have an interface which is added to both. Perfect. So in here, I've got two variables here for ALS body and capsule half height, which is one we did on the interaction episode. So I'm going to add a new one, a new function called get faction, and then the return of it will simply be the faction, and it'll be our PDA faction. And I can compile and save, and that means now both of these characters have a new interface called get faction, where we can simply drag this faction off and promote it to a variable. And then I'll tick the eyeball, I'll add it to a category of faction, and that's it. We now have a way to store faction on our player. So for the player, I'm going to default it to our player, compile and save, and then our NPC will do the same thing. So interface, get faction, promote it to a variable, so we've got the data stored. I'll eyeball it so we can edit it in the inspector, and the category I will set to faction, and I will compile and save. So now you will be able to see if we come into the world, if I click my little NPC dude here and go to his details, we can now see his faction. So let's set this guy to unaffiliated because he's not going to do anything. Actually, what I'm going to do on the NPC is I'll default everyone to unaffiliated. It's always better to have at least a faction than no faction at all. So I'm going to default everyone to be unaffiliated. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. All of our NPCs now have factions assigned. The player has a faction. They know who each other are. They can figure out who everyone is. However, it's not really useful at the moment. We've got nothing to do with it. So let's add something into it. I'm going to duplicate this guy over here, and I'm going to put him on the floor, rotate him around, and let's change his costume so he looks a bit more not him. I'm going to come and set it to the commoner, and I'm going to set the mesh there, and then I will set the faction for this one to be paladins. So they're a paladin, and then they're unaffiliated. So at the moment, when I interact with my NPC on my interact function here, it checks checks if they've got dialogue. If they have, they begin dialogue. But if they haven't, what I'm going to do instead is actually start printing stuff out in order to test it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just drag off and say get name, and then from the print string I will do append I belong to, and then we can connect it up like so. That'll say how. So it'll basically, because they don't have any dialogue, it's going to come in and basically just say I belong to this faction. Perfect. So then we'll drag off of here and we'll do another append, and this time we'll start using our function library. So I will do get faction relationship from the blueprint function library, and I can connect this up here and connect it up over here. So the current faction that's checking, it doesn't really matter, so we'll just plug it into faction for now, just temporarily. The check faction is going to be the player, so I'm going to do get player pawn, and then from here I will do get faction, because that'll be our interface for our character. And again, I can plug this in like so. This isn't permanent code, this is just to actually use the function library. And then from here we can say the space, and I will drag in the characters NPCs faction, and I'll do get name, and I will plug it into B. So I'll do the paladins and then we can drag off from the get faction player and do get name and plug it in. So the paladins and the player, and we'll do space R, and then I can drag in the faction state and plug it in here like so. So it'll say enemies, members, friends, whatever. Perfect. Let's compile and save it. And like I say, this isn't permanent code, that's why I'm leaving it messy. I'm probably going to delete it eventually. So if we set this faction here to paladins and the player here, let's go up and actually test out. So now if I walk up and interact with her, you can see it says I belong to the paladins, which she does. The paladins and our player are unaffiliated. Okay, perfect. So it's working. If I come in and change her faction to say unaffiliated and get rid of the dialogue, if I start again, it should now say that they are unaffiliated. So now, because there's no ranking, we should come up and we should pretty much see the same. I belong to unaffiliated, which is good. That means it's working correctly to find the correct faction. And then unaffiliated and player are unaffiliated. Okay, perfect. So let's test our update function now. So on my ALS player here, I'm just going to go to the event graph and I'll just add some debug keys. So I'll do debug key 1, and then we will drag off here and we will do update faction relationship from our function library here. The current faction I want to update will be the player. The check faction, I will say I want to be unaffiliated, and the relationship is we'll do 20. There we go. So we're going to increase it by 20 every single time we press debug key 1. However, if we come down, we'll do debug key 2, and I'll plug it in, and I'll say we'll do -20. So we can go up and down with the affiliated. And now we can compile and save. So now I'm going to run up. I've temporarily disabled the interact, so you can see I belong to unaffiliated. We are unaffiliated. Perfect. But if I press 1, we have now bumped up that relationship. So I come up, we are friendly. Awesome. Press it again, we are friendly still. Press it one more time, we are now a member of the unaffiliated, which doesn't make total sense, but you probably won't be changing your ranking amongst unaffiliated in case you're a villain. If I press it one more time, we're still a member. If I press down, you can see we're now being demoted to unaffiliated, dislike, and finally enemy. Perfect. So let's try it out with 2 factions then. So if I drag this faction here and drag it across like so, we'll keep the mesh the same, but what I'm going to do is set the faction to be paladins instead. And then on my player, I'm going to pretty much copy these 2 here, down here. Then I'm going to do debug key 3 and then debug key 4. Again, this is all messy code, but you can fix it up when you actually implement. There we go. So now I should be able to jump between these 2, changing my faction up and down, and then the game will basically tell you what your ranking is with this faction, and then plug it into your AI, your quests, your dialogue, anything you want in order to interact with them. So you can see if I run up to this one here and interact, you are paladins, we are unaffiliated. Come here, we are unaffiliated. If I press 1 and 3, we are now friendly with both. But if I tap 4 loads of times, we're all of a sudden an enemy of the paladins, but we're still friendly with these. If I bash 2 a bunch of times, we are now enemies of both factions. We're not in a good position. But say you come off, you do a bunch of quests, you create events or something to increase your faction rankings, so everybody suddenly likes you again, and then all of a sudden you can see we're now friendly and a member of the Paladin. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. There is the faction system that I've deployed for a couple of clients now that it seems to be working really, really well. It's highly flexible, highly usable, and yeah, it works really well. Tell me, what would you do with this faction? Is there anything else you would like to see added to it? Should we venture into the AI verse of this and take a look? Or should we plug it into some quests and dialogue and make it so they're only available if the factions exist? Let me know below. My name is Decryption, and I will see you next time.